Hello, I'm Christopher Badger.
And I'm Mark Davies.
We're barristers at Six Pump Court and would like to welcome you back to the Environmental Law News podcast, brought to you in association with LexisNexis.
Thanks, Chris. In this podcast, we'll be looking at COP26, the Silverdale Quarry Case, and climate issues for local councils.
First up, COP26.
Yes, now of course, world governments have met in Glasgow to discuss the climate emergency. Under the Paris Agreement, nations committed to keeping global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees pre-industrial levels, whilst pursuing efforts to limit rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
There are 4 COP26 goals. First, the aim is to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees C within reach. The second, to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. Third, COP26 aims to end with an agreement to mobilise finance. And finally, COP26 aims to work together to deliver.
This last and particularly nebulous sounding commitment is actually in reference to the desire to finalise the Paris rulebook, setting out nationally determined contributions from carbon, to set the rules for the transparent reporting of action, to set common timetables for emission reduction commitments, and agree mechanisms between the parties for addressing loss and damage from climate change.
The nationally determined contributions agreed at Paris were known to be inadequate, and so a mechanism was built in so that countries would have to return to the table every 5 years with fresh commitments. However, it's estimated by the UN that the current NDCs would actually result in a 16% increase in emissions, rather than the 45% cut that is considered to be needed.
And Greta Thunberg has already declared COP26 to be a failure, and at present, there isn't a great deal of evidence to suggest that she is wrong. At the Copenhagen COP in 2009, poor countries were promised that they would receive $100 billion a year by 2020, but this target has already been missed.
And China is aiming to have peak emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2060, which isn't actually any different from the commitments made by China more than a year ago. And the Chinese president didn't actually attend Glasgow at all.
And if we move on to India, it doesn't believe that it materially contributes to the problem and that it can only achieve carbon neutrality by 2070. Whereas actually India is the 4th biggest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world after China, the US and the EU. But its huge population means that the figures show emissions of 1.9 tonnes of CO2 per head of population, compared to, for example, 15.5 tonnes for the US. Despite this, India was one of several countries that did not sign the methane or coal to clean power pledges, which has the potential to seriously damage their impact.
And the UN, UK and the US have already conceded that COP26 will not achieve everything that was hoped for. But it's difficult to know how to feel about COP26. On the one hand, an announcement from India that it is aiming to hit net zero at all might be considered a success, not least because of that nation's dependence on coal. But there's such a sense of inevitability now in relation to climate change that there really is no other option but to try and make progress, which is probably why COP26 feels like such a disappointment.
And it may prove that the mechanism agreed at Paris, which was intended to continually increase NDCs, may backfire. Countries are only required to ratchet up their pledges every 5 years, so the next deadline isn't until 2025. And there are significant fears this will be too late. However, a push for an annual review of climate commitments will, we understand, not be included in the final decision from COP26.
At the time of this recording, COP26 is still ongoing, and negotiators are furiously attempting to reach agreements, in particular on climate finance and the prospect of a carbon trading system. Firmly on the agenda is trying to reach an agreement on international cooperation, on which it does not feel like much progress is being made at the moment.
Right, well, moving on, second up, tell me, Chris, what is the Silverdale Quarry Case?
The judgment in the Crown Richard Matthews against the Environment Agency in Wally's Quarry from the 16th of September of 2021 resolved a complaint by a young child who'd been very prematurely born and left with serious breathing disorder, and that threatened to develop and shorten his life. The child brought a judicial review complaining about the lack of regulatory steps by the agency to control levels of hydrogen sulfide, which greatly troubled the local community in 2021 after the landfill site increased its permit limit to accept 400,000 rather than 250,000 tonnes of waste per annum. The claims were made under Articles 2 and 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and Fordham J accepted that the EA firstly had a considerable margin of appreciation in inquiring and appraising what was wrong and in identifying the steps it should take, and secondly, that it had adequately assessed the emissions from the site and properly taken advice from Public Health England. But critically, thirdly, that the agency had failed to demonstrate that any individual officer had devised a plan in accordance with the PHE recommendation.
Well, that last point sounds particularly important.
Well, as the judge said, there is a what and a when. There is also a who. The discipline involves someone taking responsibility for the exercise of judgment. The court has thousands of pages of material, and yet there is no document before the court which adopts that discipline or begins to do so. I find it impossible to imagine that the discipline could be performed without some document somewhere reflecting that this was what was being done.
So, does the case have any wider significance?
Well, on the face of it, it might be said that this is a conventional judgment, which the Environment Agency lost on the evidence. It admitted the first 2 points, but it is the steps on the journey which are more interesting. The judge has laid out a new way of thinking about the agency's duties. The European Court on Human Rights judgments show that the agency has an operational duty as part of the UK's framework duty to ensure that Articles 2 and 8 are met. The operational duty will be assessed according to whether the obligation is historic or ongoing.
Well, I have to say this sounds complicated, particularly where the UK is looking to tighten up on environmental controls moving forwards.
Well, taking, for example, the position of regulated companies, if there is an accepted guideline standard that lowers the future threshold at which pollution will be assessed as occurring, then the agency will be obliged to regulate with that threshold in mind, by reference to the date on which that threshold comes into force. And that's going to resonate for many regulated industries as climate change and sustainability targets take hold.
And what about in the context of human rights?
Well, that might be of some advantage to regulated companies. The court's expressions of the importance of human rights obligations in this case will constitute a useful source of grounds of challenge in both criminal and civil courts and in tribunals. There are some particularly fruitful comments about the duty of sufficient inquiry in the context of the agency's regulatory decision-making.
It's probably important not to forget, of course, that this was the second agency judicial review case in 12 months in which the court was prepared to assess the merits of individual cases, the other, of course, being Safety Clean UK Limited and the Environment Agency from 2020.
Right, Mark, finally, let's get local.
Indeed. Did you know that existing planning approvals in the aviation sector already exceed any expected efficiency gains in aviation by 2050? Which means that if all these approvals are taken up, there will be no net carbon reduction in the aviation sector.
Well, that doesn't sound like it will contribute much to net zero.
Well, that's because it won't. According to a recent article by Brendan Morehouse, one of our colleagues in Chambers, other sectors will have to shoulder a greater proportion of the burden if the government's legal obligation is to be met.
But how is this a local issue?
Well, because of the decentralised approach of government, encouraging local decisions, but resulting in a patchwork of climate significant decision making. At local council level, there is recognition that the plethora of climate emergency resolutions is going to be insufficient to meet statutory targets, and that climate policy needs to be built into the planning process.
So what's that going to mean in practice?
Well, I think it means three things. Firstly, recommendations that all developments take demonstrable action to reduce embodied carbon through design and reuse with the provision of a circular economy statement. Secondly, that major developments are required to calculate a whole life carbon emission for the project. And thirdly, for performance changes between design and as built to be recorded.
So future homes will have to be built to a zero carbon standard?
Well, quite possibly, but the interesting part is how that will actually be ensured. Either it will result from changes to building regulations, or, and probably more likely if the decentralised approach is to be maintained in the short term, local authority areas will increasingly require quantifiable carbon calculations as part of the planning process. It rather reminds me of Churchill.
What? We will fight them on the beaches?
Not quite. It was a quote from 1908 when Churchill was the Liberal MP for Dundee, and he said, "What is the use of living if it be not to strive for noble causes and to make this muddled world a better place for those who will live in it after we are gone?"
Thank you for tuning in to this Environment Law News podcast. For more information on any of these stories, or if you would like to discuss any of the topics raised in more detail, please contact Six Pump Court on 0207 797 8400, asking for either Christopher Badger or Mark Davies, or contact our colleagues at LexisNexis in the PSL Environment team.